Queen Servantha of the Valkorian Empire arrived at Earth with her formidable conquest fleet, a military force that had successfully subjugated dozens of worlds through overwhelming technological superiority and strategic brilliance honed over centuries of expansion. Earth was next on her methodical expansion list, identified through careful analysis as strategically valuable for its location and resources, but militarily insignificant and therefore unlikely to mount meaningful resistance. The pattern of conquest was always essentially the same. Demonstrate overwhelming military force through orbital presence, demand immediate surrender, accept capitulation from planetary governments that recognized resistance was completely futile against such superior capabilities. Earth initially followed this established pattern. Major governments across the planet signaled willingness to negotiate terms of integration into the Valkorian Empire, rather than face potential annihilation through hopeless military confrontation. Queen Servantha landed personally to formally accept Earth's surrender, as was her established custom for significant conquests. The formal ceremony was carefully arranged in Geneva, with Earth's major political leaders present to sign the integration treaty that would bring Earth under Valkorian governance. Then Marcus Webb walked into the ceremonial chamber. He wasn't a government official or military leader. He was a history professor from a small university, wearing casual academic clothes, carrying nothing but a worn briefcase containing his research notes. Security personnel immediately tried to stop him, but he'd somehow obtained proper credentials for the ceremony. Later investigation would reveal he'd forged them with remarkable technical skill. He walked directly to the center of the formal chamber, positioned himself physically between Queen Servantha and the Earth representatives preparing to sign the treaty, and said clearly enough for everyone to hear, "No." The entire room went absolutely silent. "Excuse me?" Queen Servantha said, more genuinely curious than offended by the interruption. "No, we're not surrendering, I'm not surrendering. And I'm standing here to make that absolutely clear. You're one individual person. Your planetary governments have already agreed to integration terms. They can agree to whatever they want. I don't personally consent to being conquered. And as long as one person on this planet doesn't consent to your conquest, you haven't actually conquered Earth. You've just made a diplomatic deal with some governments under military threat." Security personnel moved to physically remove him, but Queen Servantha raised one hand in a stopping gesture. She was genuinely curious about this unexpected development. "You clearly understand that resistance is completely futile from a military perspective. My fleet could destroy your entire civilization if necessary." "Probably correct, but you'd have to destroy us to do it. You can't actually conquer people who fundamentally refuse to surrender. You can kill us, but you can't make us yours unless we agree to be yours. And I don't agree." One person's individual refusal means nothing strategically. It means everything. It means you haven't conquered Earth. At absolute best, you've negotiated with governments while at least one person explicitly refused. That's not conquest. That's just a really unbalanced treaty negotiated under threat of violence. Queen Servantha ordered Marcus arrested, but explicitly not executed. She was too genuinely intrigued by his argument and his apparently complete lack of fear in her presence. In her temporary command center established in orbit, she had him brought before her for private conversation. "Why did you do that? You accomplished nothing except your own arrest." "I accomplished making it absolutely clear that Earth hasn't surrendered. Governments signed papers, but the people haven't consented. That distinction matters fundamentally. It matters to you personally. It doesn't change the strategic reality of the situation. Doesn't it, though? You've conquered dozens of worlds over your expansion. How many of them have you actually integrated successfully versus how many are you simply occupying with constant military presence dealing with resistance?" She was quiet for a long moment, which was essentially answer enough. "You can occupy a planet with military force," Marcus continued. "But you can't actually make people part of your empire unless they choose to be or at least accept it as legitimate. You can force compliance through constant threat, but that's not the same as actual conquest. It's just expensive, unstable military occupation. You're suggesting I haven't truly conquered the worlds in my empire. I'm suggesting that conquest is substantially more complicated than military victory. The Mongols conquered the largest land empire in human history, but couldn't hold it together for long. Rome conquered vast territories, but spent centuries constantly dealing with rebellions and resistance. Spain conquered the Americas, but the descendants of those conquests eventually rejected Spanish rule entirely. Military victory isn't the same as sustainable conquest. You're a history professor. Yes, and history is remarkably clear that the most successful empires are the ones people chose to join, or at least accepted as legitimate governance. The ones built purely on military force tend to collapse the moment that force weakens or becomes overextended. Queen Cervantha considered this carefully. What exactly are you proposing? I'm proposing you can't actually conquer Earth because true conquest requires either consent or at least acceptance. And I'm personally explicitly refusing to provide that. Which means at absolute minimum you have active resistance, which means at minimum your conquest is incomplete. You're one individual person. Today, yes, but one person standing demonstrates that standing is possible. That's how resistance movements start. One person demonstrates it can be done, and others realize they can do it too. Queen Cervantha didn't execute Marcus, or even return him to formal custody. Instead, she kept talking to him over several days, genuinely curious about his historical perspective and reasoning. Over several extended conversations, he explained his reasoning in substantially more detail. Your empire spans dozens of worlds, but how many of those worlds would remain loyal if you withdrew your military presence entirely? How many joined willingly versus under explicit threat? How much of your total military resources are dedicated to occupation and suppression versus exploration and development? She provided actual numbers that essentially confirmed his central point. The vast majority of her military forces were dedicated to maintaining control over conquered territories rather than expansion or development. That's not sustainable long-term, Marcus argued. Eventually, you'll conquer something too large or too geographically distant to effectively occupy. Or you'll face multiple simultaneous rebellions that stretch your forces too thin to respond effectively. Or a rival power will exploit your overextension. Human history is absolutely full of empires that collapsed exactly this way. You're suggesting I should abandon conquest entirely as a strategy. I'm suggesting that forced conquest creates inherent instability. If you want a genuinely stable empire, you need member worlds that choose to be part of it or at least see clear value in membership beyond, will destroy you if you resist. And how would that work practically? Offer genuine partnership instead of conquest. Present what your empire actually provides: advanced technology, established trade networks, collective security arrangements, and let worlds choose to join based on demonstrated mutual benefit rather than threat. The ones that join willingly will be more stable, require substantially less military occupation, and actually contribute positively to the empire rather than just draining resources through constant occupation costs. You're describing a federation, not an empire. I'm describing a sustainable empire versus an inherently unstable one. The Roman Empire was most stable when provinces saw clear value in being part of it: infrastructure development, trade access, military protection from external threats. It became unstable when it was purely military occupation of resistant populations. Queen Cervantha argued against his examples, challenged his historical logic, tested his reasoning from multiple angles. But she couldn't entirely dismiss his fundamental points, because they aligned remarkably well with problems she'd already personally observed in administering her own empire. Even if I accepted your argument, she said, I can't simply abandon conquest as policy. My empire's culture expects territorial expansion. My government structure is built around demonstrating military success. Then Earth becomes the test case. Instead of forcing conquest, offer genuine partnership. If it works successfully, you have a new expansion model. If it fails completely, you lose nothing you wouldn't have lost anyway through expensive occupation of a resistant population. You're actually negotiating now. I'm proposing a genuine alternative. You can try to conquer Earth and deal with the inevitable resistance and occupation costs. Or you can offer real partnership and see if voluntary cooperation works better than forced submission. Queen Cervantha returned to the formal chamber, where Earth's leaders were still waiting to sign the Conquest Treaty. "I'm withdrawing the Conquest demand," she announced clearly. The room immediately erupted in confused murmurs and shocked reactions. "Instead, I'm offering genuine partnership. The Valkorian Empire will offer Earth access to our advanced technology, established trade networks, and collective security arrangements. In exchange, Earth will contribute resources and participate in Empire governance structures. This is completely voluntary. You can decline and we'll withdraw our fleet entirely." Earth's assembled leaders were genuinely stunned. This wasn't remotely the expected outcome. Over the following weeks, genuine negotiations occurred. Not about surrender terms and occupation, but about actual partnership conditions and mutual benefit. Earth's various governments engaged in intense debate about whether to join. Some argued strongly for rejection, wanting complete independence. Others argued the tangible benefits substantially outweighed the sovereignty concerns. Eventually, Earth voted to join the Valkorian Empire, narrowly, but clearly enough to be considered legitimate democratic consent. Marcus watched the actual treaty signing, this time as an invited observer rather than uninvited protester. Queen Cervantha approached him privately afterward. "You fundamentally changed the outcome through one person's explicit refusal. I demonstrated that conquest isn't inevitable. That forced submission isn't the only possible option. The actual substantive change came from you choosing to offer partnership instead of demanding surrender. I chose that approach because you made a genuinely compelling argument about sustainable empire building versus unstable military occupation, which you were already intellectually capable of understanding. I just articulated what you'd probably already observed in your own empire's administration. Why did you stand against me when you absolutely knew you couldn't win militarily? Because some principles matter more than military outcomes. The principle that people shouldn't be conquered without consent matters more than whether I personally win or lose. And sometimes one person standing demonstrates that standing is possible, which fundamentally changes what others believe is possible. You risked everything on that principle. Everything worth having is built on principles. Empires built only on military force inevitably fall. Empires built on principles, however imperfectly applied, at least have a chance of lasting. Earth's voluntary partnership with the Valkorian Empire became a widely recognized model. Queen Cervantha began offering similar voluntary terms to other worlds. Some accepted, some declined, but the ones that accepted were notably more stable and substantially less costly than the territories that had been forcibly conquered. Over extended time, the empire's fundamental character changed, less focused on conquest, more focused on partnership. Not because of grand idealism, but because it demonstrably worked better practically. Marcus returned to teaching history at his university, occasionally consulted on cross-species governance questions by alliance officials. When students asked about his confrontation with Queen Cervantha, he remained characteristically modest. "I stood against conquest because I genuinely believe people shouldn't be ruled without consent. I didn't expect to fundamentally change an empire's approach to expansion, but I demonstrated that resistance was possible, and that demonstration made negotiation possible. Sometimes one person standing is enough